Italy, 1939. The quiet town of Correggio sat like a forgotten postcard. Cobbled streets, sleepy bakeries, neighbors who knew each other by name. But beneath its rustic charm, something monstrous was simmering. Something that would turn this peaceful community into the backdrop of one of the most disturbing murder cases in Italian history. It began not with a scream, but with a whisper from the mouth of a woman who believed she had been cursed since birth. Her name was Leonarda Cianciulli. To the townspeople, she was known as the friendly soap maker, a middle-aged mother of four, always polite, always ready with a cup of tea and a loaf of homemade cake. Her home smelled of lavender and lemon rind. She read fortunes. She gave advice. She hugged too tightly, but behind her wide smile and thick apron was a woman tormented by death. Born in 1894 in Montella, Italy, Leonarda's life had been marked by tragedy from the very beginning. Her mother, Emilia Dinolfi, had been forced to marry a man she didn't love, Leonarda's father, after becoming pregnant out of wedlock. This resentment shaped Leonarda's early years, casting her as an unwanted child, a burden in a loveless home. From a young age, Leonarda believed she was cursed not metaphorically, but literally. Her mother, she insisted, had placed a black hex on her, and for most of her life events seemed to support this terrifying belief. By the time she was a young adult, Leonarda had already attempted suicide twice. She suffered violent seizures and episodes of depression. When she finally married a registry clerk named Raffaele Pansardi, her mother disapproved and allegedly cursed the union. Shortly afterward, their home was destroyed by an earthquake. Then she was imprisoned for fraud. Her shops failed. Her health declined. But worst of all, and what shaped the rest of her life, were her pregnancies. Leonarda would go on to be pregnant 17 times. 3 children were miscarried. 10 died in infancy or early childhood. Only 4 survived, and those 4 became the core of her universe. She was a mother not just by biology, but by obsession. She hovered over her children. She feared every illness, every bruise. She clung to them with a suffocating love, convinced that death was always one step behind. So when her eldest and favorite son Giuseppe announced in 1939 that he intended to join the Italian army, Leonarda's fragile world shattered. She believed with utter conviction that he would die. And this is where her story crosses the threshold from tragedy into horror. You see, Leonarda wasn't just a grieving mother. She was also deeply superstitious. Throughout her life, she had visited fortune tellers, palm readers, and even Romani witches. One told her, "In your right hand I see prison, in your left a criminal asylum." Another told her, "You will outlive your children." But in her mind, these prophecies were not fates, they were challenges. And Leonarda believed she had found a solution. She began to study ancient folklore rituals from southern Italy and rural grimoires that spoke of protection magic. One belief caught her attention and consumed her mind: the idea of human sacrifice as a way to appease fate. The notion that an offering of blood could shield a loved one from death. So in her warped logic, if Giuseppe was going to war, she needed to give someone else's life to protect his. And she knew just the person. In early 1939, a woman named Faustina Setti came to Leonarda's home. She was unmarried, older, desperate for companionship. She trusted Leonarda, who offered to help her find a husband, but only if she followed her instructions carefully. Faustina, naive and hopeful, wrote letters to her imaginary suitor. Leonarda dictated them. She told Faustina to tell no one about her departure and to come visit one final time before she left. Faustina did exactly that. On the day she arrived, Leonarda gave her wine, drugged. Faustina collapsed, and with chilling precision, Leonarda picked up an axe and killed her. This is not fiction. This is documented sworn testimony. Leonarda described it herself later in court in gruesome detail. "I threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, which I had bought to make soap, and stirred the mixture until the pieces dissolved in a thick, dark mush. I poured it into several buckets and emptied it in a nearby septic tank." But she wasn't done. Faustina's blood, collected in a basin, was baked into tea cakes. Leonarda, who had always prided herself on her cooking, dried the blood in the oven, mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, and milk. Then she served the cakes to neighbors and friends. She ate them herself. All the while, she claimed to feel stronger, more spiritually charged. She believed that the ritual had worked, that death had been tricked, that fate had been paid off in full. And so began one of the most chilling serial killing sprees in European history, not born of lust or greed, but of superstition, ritual, and motherly madness. Leonarda Cianciulli had crossed a line from superstition to savagery, and she did it with an eerie calm. Her first victim, Faustina Setti, was now gone, dissolved in soap, baked into blood cakes, and in Leonarda's twisted mind, a successful offering to the forces of fate. But one sacrifice, she reasoned, might not be enough. War was chaos, unpredictable. Giuseppe, her beloved son, was still preparing to leave for the battlefield. What if death wasn't yet satisfied? What if the curse still lingered in the air? So she prepared again, not for remorse, but for another ritual. Her next victim was Francesca Soavi, a middle-aged woman who had once worked as a schoolteacher. Like Faustina, Francesca came to Leonarda in confidence, seeking help, this time for employment. She was desperate to leave Correggio and had heard Leonarda could pull strings. And again, Leonarda played the same role, helpful, generous, wise. She told Francesca she had found her a job at a girls' school in Piacenza. All she had to do was write postcards to send to friends explaining she was leaving but well, and to trust Leonarda with the details. On September 5, 1940, Francesca entered Leonarda's home for the final time, and the pattern repeated. Drugged wine, a swift blow with the axe, dismemberment, boiling flesh in caustic soda, blood collected in a basin. And then the baking. Leonarda turned Francesca's blood into tea cakes again, blending it with chocolate and flour. She later confessed that she served the treats to her neighbors, her children, and even to Giuseppe himself. No one suspected a thing. In fact, people adored Leonarda's baking. Her hospitality became a local point of pride. She'd often be heard saying, "Eat, eat. You're too thin," with a smile that few would ever forget after the truth came out. The cakes weren't just a product of madness. They were a symbol of her delusion, the idea that death could be tamed, that cannibalizing the dead gave her power, that her hands could shape fate itself like dough. But if the second murder emboldened her, the third would become her undoing. Her final victim was a woman named Virginia Cacioppo, a former soprano who had once performed at La Scala in Milan. Unlike the others, Virginia was well known. She carried herself with confidence. She was elegant, refined. She had fallen on hard times after her singing career ended and came to Leonarda hoping for a fresh start. Leonarda offered her exactly that, a job with a mysterious theatre director in Florence. Just like before, she urged Virginia to tell no one and to write letters that would later be mailed from the city to throw off suspicion. Virginia agreed, but this time something changed. The murder followed the same pattern: drugging, axe, dismemberment, boiling. But Leonarda later recalled that Virginia's flesh was fat and white, perfect for soap making. She said, "I made lots of soap and gave bars to neighbors and friends. The cakes too were better, sweeter." That woman was really sweet. These weren't confessions made under duress. They weren't dragged from her by interrogators. Leonarda spoke with pride, with gusto, as if she were sharing a favorite recipe rather than a horror. But Virginia's disappearance triggered whispers. She had family, she had social connections, and when the letters arrived, clearly written under dictation, suspicions grew. A few days later, a report was filed. Police began asking questions, and finally, someone mentioned that Virginia had last been seen entering Leonarda Cianciulli's home. The investigation escalated quickly. Police searched Leonarda's property. In her kitchen, they found pots and pans that reeked of chemicals. They found remnants of melted fat and dark residue lining her soap molds. And then they found human remains. But what stunned the officers most wasn't what they saw, it was what they heard. Because before they could even finish their questioning, Leonarda Cianciulli confessed. Not just to Virginia's murder, not just to Francesca's, but to all three in horrifying detail. She spoke without remorse, without hesitation, without apology. She described the blood, the recipes, the texture of the cakes, the way the soap lathered better when the fat was fresh. She called her victims necessary. She described herself not as a monster, but as a mother doing what needed to be done. The investigators were speechless. One officer would later say, "She confessed as if describing how she made ravioli." But beneath the theatrical horror lay a chilling truth. Leonarda believed she had saved her son. In her eyes, Giuseppe was still alive because she had done what no mother would dare: offer up others their bodies, their blood, their very essence to shield the one she loved. And now she had become something more than a murderer. She had become a legend. As the truth of Leonarda Cianciulli's crimes unraveled the people of Correggio, and soon the entire nation of Italy were struck by a singular question. How could a mother do this? In 1940, the country was already reeling. Mussolini had thrown Italy into the war alongside Nazi Germany. Rations were scarce. Bombs were falling. But nothing in the daily news compared to the grotesque revelations seeping out of that quiet house on Via Cavour. Human soap, blood cakes, cannibalism. It was unthinkable. And yet it was all true. The case gripped the Italian press. Headlines screamed phrases like "the soap-maker witch madwoman of Correggio" and "la saponificatrice." Journalists descended on the town. Neighbors, who once accepted Leonarda's cakes, now shuddered in horror. Children whispered her name like a ghost story. But for Leonarda, the attention felt earned. In fact, she reveled in it. During interrogation, she corrected officers on the details of her murders. She grew frustrated when they misunderstood her recipes. She insisted on describing each step of the rituals, explaining how human fat yielded superior soap to any animal product. Her tone was not remorseful, it was instructional. She said, "I gave the copper ladle which I used to skim the fat off the kettles to my country, which was so badly in need of metal during the last days of the war." She framed her actions not as cruelty but as sacrifice. And when she was formally charged, she showed no resistance, no tears, no begging, only preparation for her grand performance. In 1946, after the war ended and Mussolini was executed, Italy finally put Leonarda Cianciulli on trial. It was one of the most anticipated legal spectacles of the post-war years. People traveled from across the country to watch. The courtroom in Reggio Emilia was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters jostled for space. And at the center of it all stood a 52-year-old woman in black, flanked by guards smiling. The prosecution detailed the evidence with clinical precision. 3 missing women, identical patterns of disappearance letters dictated under Leonarda's hand, blood traces found in her home bone fragments, and above all her full confession, given voluntarily, even proudly. But Leonarda didn't sit silently as her crimes were laid bare. She interrupted, corrected, clarified. When prosecutors described how she dismembered the bodies, she stood up and announced, No, that's not how it happened. Let me explain." And then she did in full gruesome detail, as if reading from a cookbook. The courtroom recoiled, but the press couldn't get enough. Here was a woman who had boiled humans like meat, and then served the remains to friends. And she spoke as if she were demonstrating a recipe on national television. Even the defense was stunned. Her lawyers attempted an insanity plea. They brought in psychiatrists who described her delusions, her traumatic childhood, the loss of 13 children, and her absolute belief in magic and curses. They painted her as a woman unhinged by grief, a mother whose mind had snapped under unbearable loss. But Leonarda rejected the strategy. She didn't want to be seen as mad. She wanted to be understood as a mother who did what needed to be done. In her own words, "I was not crazy, I was just desperate. My children are my life." The jury was unmoved. On October 15, 1946, Leonarda Cianciulli was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, as well as fraud, corpse desecration, and theft. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum, a fate eerily foretold by the fortune-teller decades earlier. But even in confinement, Leonarda kept writing. She composed her memoir, an unpublished volume titled An Embittered Soul's Confessions. In it, she described her crimes with the same theatrical flair, still referring to her victims, not by name, but by function. The first woman, the second woman, the fat soprano. She called her story one of maternal sacrifice, and disturbingly, some Italians agreed. Letters arrived at her prison praising her devotion to her son. Some called her the mother of the century. Others requested her soap recipe, believing it must have been miraculous if it came from such a passionate heart. This wasn't just a reflection of Leonarda's manipulation. It reflected a society grappling with war trauma, superstition, and gendered expectations of motherhood. To some, she was evil. To others, she was a martyr. But to the families of her victims, she was simply a murderer. Faustina, Francesca, and Virginia were all buried quietly. Their bodies never fully recovered. Their names, often forgotten in sensational retellings, were the only real tragedy in a circus that turned a killer into a folk legend. And so the trial ended. The crowds went home, the papers moved on. But in a quiet prison cell, the soap maker of Correggio continued to tell her story again and again, as if repeating it might somehow make it noble. What kind of person justifies murder with motherhood? What kind of person bathes in blood and calls it devotion? To understand Leonarda Cianciulli is to walk the uneasy line between delusion and control, between mystical belief and calculated manipulation. Because while her crimes were rooted in superstition, they were also shockingly systematic. And the more investigators, psychologists, and criminologists studied her, the more they realized Leonarda wasn't insane in the way the public imagined. She was something else. She was a woman who had weaponized grief. Leonarda lost 10 children in infancy. 3 others never saw the light of day. In her world, this wasn't just misfortune, it was cosmic punishment. A pattern, a curse, a war between her and the fates. When Giuseppe announced his intention to join the army, Leonarda didn't just fear losing him, she believed it was inevitable unless she intervened. And so she reached for what she knew, old southern Italian folk magic passed down through generations. From the ashes of rural poverty and superstition came beliefs in blood rituals, curses, and sacrifice. But Leonarda didn't merely follow these rituals. She rewrote them. She fused folk beliefs with personal theology, creating a system in which murder became holy, soap became sacred, and blood became the highest form of protection. In her unpublished memoir, Confessions of an Embittered Soul, she wrote, "Each life I took made Giuseppe's shadow clearer. Every drop of blood gave him strength." But Leonarda's manipulations weren't limited to rituals. She chose her victims carefully. Faustina, the lonely spinster with no family. Francesca, the fallen teacher with no social power. Virginia, aging single and struggling. These were not random targets. These were women who could disappear without scandal. Women who had trusted Leonarda as a friend, counselor, and spiritual guide. She didn't kill out of passion. She killed with calm precision. There were no signs of struggle, no erratic behavior before the murders. She purchased the caustic soda in advance. She instructed victims to write staged letters. She disposed of remains in chemical solutions, not in panic, but in ritualistic procedure. If she was mad, it was not the kind that screams. It was the kind that smiles while stirring human fat. Psychiatrists were divided. Some argued that she suffered from paranoid psychosis, driven by obsessive-compulsive delusions and grief-induced mania. Others pointed to narcissistic tendencies, noting her need for attention, her theatrical storytelling, and her refusal to express remorse. But a few saw something deeper, something chilling. Leonarda may have believed in magic, yes, but she also understood power. She held power over her victims through trust, over the town through respect, over her son through emotional control, over the courtroom through charm. In fact, some experts now argue that her obsession with saving Giuseppe wasn't mystical, it was possessive. To her, Giuseppe was more than a son. He was a symbol of her only success, her only surviving male child, her only legacy in a world where motherhood was often the only identity a woman could claim. To lose him to war would mean losing herself. So she turned to murder. And when she was finally arrested and separated from Giuseppe, her mind shifted again, not toward guilt, but toward immortality. She wanted her story to be told. She wanted it written, remembered, immortalized in newspaper columns, legal records, even popular songs. And in this she succeeded. Her case became legend. Her nickname, La Saponificatrice di Correggio, was whispered like a dark fairy tale. People sold postcards of her face, wrote ballads, wove her into Italy's Gothic folklore. But with every retelling, a disturbing truth emerged. Leonarda Cianciulli wasn't just a killer, she was a myth maker. She crafted her own legacy from the bones of her victims, literally and symbolically. She took control of the narrative from start to finish. Even in prison, she rewrote history, made herself the protagonist, the tragic mother, the witch, the martyr. And Giuseppe, he survived the war, but he never spoke publicly about what his mother did, never gave interviews, never issued a statement. He disappeared from public life. Because how could you speak about a mother who killed 3 women to save you? How could you live with the knowledge that your survival was bought with soap and blood? That's the real legacy Leonarda left behind. Not her macabre recipes, but a question that never dies. If someone claims to kill for love, is it still love? Or is it something far darker? Italy had barely emerged from the ruins of World War II when the story of Leonarda Cianciulli hit the headlines. The country was shattered economically, emotionally, spiritually. Mussolini was dead, the monarchy had fallen, and people were desperate for something, anything to make sense of the chaos. So when the story of a soap-making serial killer broke, it didn't just become front-page news. It became legend. In the chaos of the post-war years, Leonarda's tale gave Italians something horrifyingly specific to focus on. While much of the country tried to forget the war, her story was impossible to ignore. It was grotesque, yes, but also hypnotic. There was a theatrical quality to it. A kind of perverse poetry in the idea of a mother who murdered to protect her son, who boiled bodies into soap, who smiled through her sentencing. She became a national fascination, not despite her crimes, but because of them. Tabloids covered her trial obsessively. Artists painted her likeness. Street singers composed morbid ballads about the woman who washed away her sins with soap. Kids dared each other to walk past her house at night. And in a country still steeped in Catholicism and folklore, many whispered, was she a witch? Or worse, was she right? Because Giuseppe came back alive. That simple fact, the success of her sacrifice, made people uncomfortable. It gave her story a twisted logic. It suggested in the most disturbing way that her murders had worked. And Leonarda leaned into that discomfort. Even behind bars, she entertained journalists, scholars, and the occasional curious priest. She retold her story with flair, as though performing a tragic opera in which she was both composer and leading lady. Her prison guards described her as courteous, helpful, even maternal. She baked, she cleaned, she made soap for the wardens, she wrote pages upon pages of memoirs. She wasn't hiding her crimes, she was curating them. Over time, Leonarda's legend grew beyond the court records and into popular culture. Her story was adapted for theatre, radio, literature, even film. In 1977, Italian director Mauro Bolognini released a film titled Gran Bolito, a black comedy loosely based on Leonarda's life. In it, the killer is portrayed not as a snarling monster, but as a woman so consumed by maternal fear that she becomes her own executioner. The film's surreal and operatic blurred the lines between tragedy and satire, just as Leonarda had blurred the lines between love and death. This was not accidental. Leonarda had crafted her own myth, and now others were building on top of it. She became a modern-day Medusa, a figure both feared and pitied, reviled and mythologized. But lost in all of this were the victims. Faustina Setti, Francesca Soavi, Virginia Cacioppo. 3 women, 3 lives, each with their own stories, hopes, pains. In the myth of the soap maker, they became props, ingredients, even in someone else's narrative. Rarely were they spoken of as real people. Instead, they were reduced to archetypes: the lonely spinster, the quiet teacher, the aging diva. No national tributes, no streets renamed, just footnotes in a legend that wasn't theirs. And perhaps that's the most sinister legacy of Leonarda Cianciulli. Not just that she killed, but that she rewrote reality, made herself the center, the martyr, the myth. And in doing so, she erased those she destroyed. This erasure extended beyond the victims. It seeped into how society began to frame her crimes as something exceptional, even poetic. A killer who baked cakes. A woman who stirred human fat into soap. These phrases stuck. They haunted the imagination. They became clickbait before the internet existed. Leonarda's name wasn't just remembered, it was marketed. Even today, her case is retold in podcasts, documentaries, and horror websites. There are Halloween costumes based on her, recipe parodies, true crime merchandise. But behind the dark fascination lies an unsettling truth. Leonarda Cianciulli isn't unique because she killed. She's unique because she made society complicit in the spectacle of her madness. And as long as her story is retold without nuance, she continues to win, not in life, but in legacy. Because for Leonarda, being forgotten was always the greatest fear. Time passed. The headlines faded. Italy rebuilt itself slowly, awkwardly, painfully. But Leonarda Cianciulli remained. Within the cold walls of the criminal asylum at Pozzuoli, she no longer had a stage. There were no jurors to impress, no journalists to charm, no kitchen to fill with the aroma of almond cakes made with stolen blood. Only stone walls, steel bars, and women more broken than herself. For a time, she clung to what little spotlight remained. Visitors, journalists, psychologists, even the occasional occultist still sought her out. She answered their questions like a seasoned performer, reciting her lines with clarity, flair, and a faint smile. Sometimes she rewrote her answers. Sometimes she embellished. Other times she said nothing at all, preferring silence to repetition. But as the years wore on, interest waned. She was no longer the saponificatrice di Correggio in public imagination. She was just another inmate, aging frail and growing increasingly irrelevant to a nation now consumed by Cold War anxieties, modernization, and mass emigration. Still, she wrote her memoir, Le confessioni di un'anima amareggiata. The Confessions of a Bitter Soul grew into hundreds of handwritten pages. It was part autobiography, part ritual manual, part moral reflection. In it, she described her victims not just as sacrifices, but as echoes, extensions of her own suffering. She claimed they had not died in vain, that their blood had purified her son's path. She spoke of omens, bloodlines, ancient spirits. She compared herself to Abraham, to Medea, to the Virgin Mary. Delusion, defense mechanism, or deliberate myth-making? Maybe all three. Guards often found her muttering incantations to herself, tracing invisible sigils on her cell walls, whispering names no one else understood. She was both feared and pitied by other inmates, not for her crimes, but for her presence. There was something wrong about her aura, they said. A stillness that felt like a loaded gun. And Giuseppe, he never came. After the trial, he vanished into civilian life. Records suggest he married, moved north, changed his name. Perhaps he couldn't bear the infamy. Perhaps he carried guilt too heavy to speak of. Perhaps he truly believed his mother had saved him and hated her for it. Leonarda never mentioned him bitterly. She remained steadfast in her narrative. Everything I did was for Giuseppe. I would do it again. Even as her health declined, first arthritis, then partial blindness, then stomach cancer, she refused to ask for forgiveness. Not once did she express sorrow to the families of the women she murdered. Not once did she recant her belief in the power of sacrifice. To the very end, Leonarda believed she was a woman who had made peace with the darkness and in doing so had beaten fate at its own game. In 1970, at the age of 76, Leonarda Cianciulli died in the asylum. No family visited, no funeral was held. She was buried in a quiet, unmarked grave, a woman who had once captivated a nation, now lowered into the dirt with no prayers, no candles, no cakes. But her story didn't die. The artifacts from her crimes, her soap molds, the axes. The copper pot used to boil her victims were preserved. Not destroyed. Preserved. They now rest behind glass in the Criminological Museum in Rome, labeled neatly clinically. Tourists stroll past them stunned, horrified, fascinated. A killer's tools displayed like relics, like religious artifacts, like trophies. And that perhaps is the final irony. Leonarda spent her entire life obsessed with ritual, sacrifice, preservation, protection. She wanted to become eternal, to write her name into the blood-soaked folds of history. And she succeeded. Not in the way she imagined, not as a saint or a mother goddess, but as a symbol, a cautionary tale. A woman consumed by myth and madness, who became her own grotesque legacy. Even in death she was preserved, just like her soap. In the decades since her death, Leonarda Cianciulli has not faded into obscurity. She's become more infamous. Her name appears in every list of history's most disturbing killers. Her face stares back from true crime thumbnails. Her tale is whispered on horror podcasts and splashed across YouTube. There are novels inspired by her theatre productions, even underground artwork. Why? Why do we continue to feed the memory of a woman who fed others with human flesh? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary. Because Leonarda was not just a killer, she was a story. And humans are addicted to stories, especially the darkest ones. In Leonarda's case, the elements are irresistible: a grieving mother, blood rituals, cannibalistic undertones, soap and cake made from human bodies. It reads like horror fiction, but it's true. And truth, when it's stranger than fiction, becomes seductive. Psychologists call this morbid curiosity. It's the same impulse that makes us slow down at car crashes, that draws us toward horror movies, that keeps us reading articles about crimes we'd never dare commit ourselves. It's distance in safety, the ability to confront terror without consequence. But with Leonarda, there's something deeper. She's not just a monster, she's a mother. And that contradiction is where the obsession truly lives. Society venerates mothers, exalts them, frames them as gentle, nurturing, selfless. The archetypal mother gives life sacrifices herself for her children, protects at all costs. Leonarda embodied that ideal to the extreme. She sacrificed others for her son. She killed, cooked, and served in the name of protection. So we ask, was it love? Was it madness? Was it both? This tension between nurture and horror, between cake and corpse, is what makes her story echo through time. Leonarda challenges our assumptions. She reminds us that evil doesn't always wear fangs or wield guns. Sometimes it smiles, gently offers you a biscuit, and calls itself Mama. Worse still, society itself helped build her myth. In the 1940s, the press portrayed her as a caricature, a grotesque but compelling villain. Over time, this portrayal evolved into entertainment. Her victims were background noise, while her persona was center stage. She was given nicknames: the soap maker, the witch of Correggio, la saponificatrice. Nicknames are for celebrities, not murderers. But true crime has always walked this fine line. It reveals injustice, yes, but it also runs the risk of glorifying the criminal, turning tragedy into spectacle. Leonarda's case became that spectacle, and we, the audience, keep buying tickets. But if we look deeper, her story reflects more than just gore. It reflects fear, fear of death, fear of motherhood twisted, fear of rituals and beliefs we don't understand, fear that evil doesn't always look like evil. Her murders weren't impulsive. They were methodical, planned, wrapped in the familiar, in the domestic. The oven, the kitchen, the handwritten letters, the cups of tea. That's what unsettles us most. She made home into horror. And in doing so, she violated something sacred, the trust we place in those around us. The idea that we know our neighbors, that kindness is genuine, that a smiling woman offering you soap is just that, a kind soul. Leonarda shattered that illusion, and because of that, we can't stop telling her story. Not to celebrate her, but because she forces us to look at the shadows in our own mirrors, the parts of human nature we don't want to see. Decades have passed since Leonarda Cianciulli's death. The copper pot is still there behind glass in Rome, a relic of a time when one woman's grief boiled over into ritual murder. The mold she used for her soap, the ladle, the rusted knife, the basin, all preserved with chilling neatness. Visitors stare in silence. Some laugh nervously, some take selfies, others leave visibly shaken. But the question remains, why do we still care? Because what Leonarda left behind is more than soap, more than horror, more than the 3 lives she took. She left a cultural scar, one etched not just into true crime history, but into the way we talk about women, motherhood, faith, and control. In the courtroom, she was asked again and again, why? And again, she gave an answer no one wanted to hear. Because I loved him, Giuseppe survived. But 3 women did not. Faustina, Francesca, Virginia. Their names are rarely remembered, overshadowed by the woman who ended their lives, reduced to ingredients in someone else's legacy. Faustina was saving for a new life. Francesca was trying to find her footing again after loss. Virginia still performed on the smallest stages, holding on to fading dreams. They were human beings, not just footnotes, and yet Leonarda knew something the rest of the world often ignores. Memory is malleable. If you control the story, you control the perception. You get to choose what's remembered and what's erased. And Leonarda, for all her madness, was a master storyteller. She gave interviews. She wrote books. She invited audiences into her twisted mythology. And she succeeded in one of the most chilling ways imaginable. She made herself unforgettable. So now we must ask, what responsibility do we have as storytellers, viewers, listeners? To whom do we owe our curiosity? To the killer or the killed? True crime at its best is about justice, about giving voice to those who can no longer speak. but at its worst, it becomes entertainment built atop real suffering. Leonarda's tale should not be remembered because it's bizarre, or cinematic, or meme-worthy. It should be remembered because it is real, because it happened, because 3 women trusted someone and were destroyed by that trust, and because one nation, one culture, and now one digital world continues to echo her name far louder than theirs. In the end, we return to the simple fact: Leonarda Cianciulli was not a monster from folklore. She was not a fictional villain conjured in a horror novel. She was a woman. She lived, she grieved, she chose, and she killed. What makes her terrifying is not how different she was, but how familiar. She lived in a quiet town. She baked cakes. She wore an apron. She smiled. She wrote letters. She believed she was doing good. She believed she was right. That belief cost lives. So when we remember the soap maker of Correggio, let it not be with fascination or folklore, but with clarity. Let us remember Faustina, Francesca, and Virginia. Let us remember what happens when belief eclipses reason, when love distorts into possession, when pain curdles into delusion. Let us remember that evil does not always announce itself with fangs. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a mother, with a warm smile and a bar of soap.